She paid $11 for it at a county surplus auction where nobody else raised their hand. The building had been a railway station once, brick and timber, a covered platform running its length, at the edge of a town called Ferris Hollow that had been losing people for 40 years. The windows were cracked. The platform boards were rotted through. Beneath the platform was a storage room sealed with rust and time and whatever had been left inside it. Nobody knew what was in that room. Nobody had thought to look. Eugenia was 71 when her son drove her to a motel and left her with $250. She had 11 days before the money ran out. What came after was the station. What she found beneath the platform changed everything, and what she built in the years that followed stopped everyone in Ferris Hollow who thought they knew how a story like this ended. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Eugenia had spent 38 years drawing things that did not yet exist. That was the work, at its simplest. A patent illustrator and technical draftsman sat at a table with a set of instruments and a piece of paper and made precise, dimensioned, legally accurate drawings of machines and buildings and mechanisms, drawings that would be submitted to patent offices and engineering firms and construction teams, drawings that had to be right in every particular, because the things built from them had to be right in every particular. It was exacting work. It was solitary work. It was, for Eugenia, the most natural thing in the world. She had started in a small engineering firm when she was 23, one of 2 women in the drafting room, and she had stayed in that profession for almost 4 decades, moving twice to better firms, building a reputation for the kind of accuracy and clarity that meant her drawings went through review without comment. She had a gift for seeing the interior logic of a mechanism, the way a thing was meant to move and fit and hold, and for translating that logic onto paper in a way that made it immediately legible to anyone who needed to understand it. She did this work with instruments, with compasses and ruling pens and set squares and technical pencils. She was still doing it by hand when the profession moved almost entirely to computer-aided design, and she stayed with her instruments for longer than most, because the work she did by hand was simply better than what the machines produced in those early years, and her clients knew it. She retired at 61. Not because she wanted to, exactly, but because her husband Bernard had been diagnosed with a progressive condition that would take most of his remaining years, and she wanted those years to be spent with him rather than at a drafting table. Bernard had been a quiet man, a high school mathematics teacher who loved order and precision, and who had understood from their first conversation that Eugenia's work was not a job, but a form of thinking, the way some people thought in words, and Eugenia thought in lines and dimensions and tolerances. He had been proud of her in the steady, non-performing way of someone who did not need an audience for their admiration. He died when she was 68, a long decline and then an ending as those things went. She moved into the spare room of her son Bryce's house 8 months later. Bryce was 42, a commercial property developer with a talent for identifying undervalued assets and a tendency to approach all situations, including human ones, through the lens of that talent. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had organized his thinking around utility for so long that other frameworks had atrophied. His wife, Annalise, was pleasant and distant in the way of someone who had not been consulted about the spare room arrangement and had agreed to it without enthusiasm. Eugenia understood all of this from the first week and made herself as unobtrusive as possible. She kept the spare room tidy. She cooked twice a week and cleaned up without being asked. She did not offer opinions about the running of the household. She took long walks in the mornings and spent the afternoons reading and, when she could not bear not to, making small, precise drawings in a notebook she kept in the bedside drawer. Elevations of the houses on the street, the profile of the garden wall, the bracket configuration of the porch railing, small exercises, the way a musician runs scales in a room where there is no audience. She had a mechanical pencil that she kept in the pocket of whatever she was wearing. It was brushed silver, the kind made for technical drawing, with a fine lead and a weight that felt correct in the hand in a way that cheap pencils did not. Along the barrel, in small engraved capitals, her name. A retirement gift from the firm, from the colleagues who had worked alongside her for 15 years and who had understood, better than she had, that she would miss the work. She had carried it every day since. She was in Bryce's spare room for 3 years. On a Wednesday morning in February, Bryce knocked on the door before she had finished dressing and came in with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something. He said that he and Annalisa had been thinking, and that they felt Eugenia might be more comfortable somewhere with more support, somewhere designed for people at her stage of life, with activities and community and staff on hand. He said this in the measured, reasonable tone of someone presenting a business case, which was, she understood, the only tone he had for things that mattered. Willa was in the hallway behind him. Willa was 38, Eugenia's daughter, a woman who felt things fully and acted on them rarely, who had inherited her father's capacity for understanding and her own particular incapacity for doing much about it. She stood in the hallway with her coat already on, her handbag over one shoulder, and while Bryce spoke, she reached down and took the strap of her handbag between both hands and began to fold it against itself and unfold it again. Fold and unfold. She did not look at Eugenia while she did it. She looked at the floor between them. Eugenia looked at Willa's hands on the strap. She did not say what she might have said. She went to the bedside table and picked up the notebook and put it in her coat pocket. She put the mechanical pencil in the other pocket where it always lived. She picked up the bag she had packed the night before because she had heard Bryce and Annalisa talking in the kitchen the previous evening and had understood enough to know that morning would bring this conversation. She had packed the night before. That was the thing she would think about later, the thing that told her something about how clearly she had seen where she was, even when she had not let herself look directly at it. They drove 40 minutes to a motel at the edge of the county. It was a low brick building with a parking lot and a vending machine outside room 7 and a front desk staffed by a teenager who did not look up when they came in. Bryce carried her bag to the room. He put $250 in cash on the dresser and said he would call to check in and that this was just while they sorted the next steps. He left. Willa paused in the doorway on her way out. She looked at Eugenia directly for the first time that morning, and what was in her face was fully visible and fully useless, the expression of someone who knows what they are doing and is doing it anyway. The door closed. Eugenia sat on the edge of the bed. The room was clean enough. The window looked onto the parking lot. The $250 on the dresser was a specific and insufficient number that she did not need to do the arithmetic on to understand. She put her hand in her coat pocket and held the mechanical pencil. She sat there for a while. The motel room was clean in the way that motel rooms were clean, surfaces wiped but not restored, the smell of the cleaning products sitting on top of a deeper smell that no product reached. The curtain over the window was a dark gold that had once been brighter. The television was bolted to the dresser. She did not turn it on. She took the notebook out of her coat pocket and set it on the bed beside her. She did not open it yet. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at the window and at the strip of parking lot visible through the gap in the curtain. She had been practical her whole life. She had been a person who looked at a situation clearly and worked out what could be done, and did it. This had served her in the drafting room and in the years of Bernard's illness, and in the months after his death, when there had been so much to organize, so many interlocking practical requirements that had kept her moving when moving was the only thing that kept her upright. She had always known what the next step was. She did not, in that motel room, know what the next step was. She opened the notebook and found a blank page and wrote down what she had. $250, a bag, a coat, the notebook, the mechanical pencil. The name of the county assistant's office that she had looked up on the library computer 3 months ago when she had begun, very quietly and without telling herself she was doing it, to understand that the spare room arrangement was not a permanent situation. She wrote down what she knew about her options: the county assistant's office, a church shelter whose address she had noted, the public library, which had computers and was warm, the diner 2 blocks from the motel that had a breakfast special for $4.90. She looked at the list. Then she closed the notebook and lay down on the bed with her coat on and looked at the ceiling and let herself understand, without flinching from it, what had happened. 11 days. That was what the money gave her, eating carefully, staying in the room. She walked to the diner each morning and ordered the cheapest thing and nursed the coffee and thought. She was not panicking. She had never been a person who panicked. She was a person who looked at a problem until she understood its dimensions and then worked out from the inside the same way she approached a complex drawing. What were the fixed points? What were the variables? What was the margin? The margin was very small. She called Bryce on the 8th day. He answered and listened and said he was working on the next steps and that she should not worry. She recognized this as a thing people said when they had stopped working on something and did not want to say so. She did not call Willa. She went to the county assistant's office on the 9th day. The woman at the desk was kind and overworked and gave her a list of resources and a referral for temporary shelter placement and told her the waiting list for longer-term options was substantial. She said she was sorry in a way that meant she genuinely was and could not change it. Eugenia thanked her and walked back out into the gray morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. There was a bulletin board on the wall of the county building. She had walked past it without looking on her way in. On her way out, she stopped and read it. Mostly lost animal flyers and church notices and a pest control advertisement. In the lower left corner, a printed sheet. County surplus property auction. The following Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Properties with delinquent taxes or unclaimed status conveyed to highest bidder. Minimum opening bid $11. List available inside. She went back inside and asked for the list. She took it to the public library, which she had been using each afternoon since the 3rd day, and sat at a computer and looked up every property on it. 14 properties. 12 were bare land parcels. 1 was a residential ruin with violations so extensive the repair cost would have been punishing. 1 was listed as a historic structure, brick construction, approximately 1,200 square feet, platform included, on a quarter-acre lot, at the junction of 2 county roads in a town called Ferris Hollow. Condemned for occupancy but structurally assessed as sound per inspection 4 years prior. No bids registered. She looked up Ferris Hollow and found a photograph of the station taken sometime in the 1990s before it closed. Brick, single-story, a low-hipped roof, a covered platform along the trackside, a round window above the main entrance that she recognized immediately as a detail from a particular period of regional railway architecture, late Victorian, the kind of thing built to last a century. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at it the way she had always looked at a new commission before she picked up a pencil, finding the structure of it, the logic underneath the surface. She wrote $11 in her notebook beside the property listing. Then she looked at the number for a while. Then she closed the notebook and took the bus back to the motel and lay down on the bed with her coat on and looked at the ceiling. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed about the round window. She could see, even in the photograph, that the glass was still in it. In the morning, she was at the county office when it opened. The auction room was a conference room with a folding table and 4 metal chairs. The officer running it was a woman in her 50s who sorted papers without looking up. Two other people came in, read the list, and left before proceedings started. When the station at Ferris Hollow was read out, Eugenia raised her hand. Nobody else moved. The officer wrote $11 on the form and slid the paperwork across the table. Eugenia filled it in. Her hand was steady. She held the deed on the bus to Ferris Hollow. A single page. Her name on it in the county officer's careful handwriting. She looked at her name for most of the ride, and then looked out the window as the town gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to the smaller roads that ran between dying towns, and when she saw the station roof above the tree line, she recognized it before the bus reached the stop. The particular profile of it, the low-hipped line and the chimney stack, and the shape of what she could see of the round window catching the cold morning light. The station sat at the edge of town where the county road bent south. She saw it from the bus window before the stop and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. She got off at the stop and walked back to it. It was better than the photograph and worse than she had hoped, which was about what she had expected. The brick was good, dense and dark red, laid in a Flemish bond that spoke to the care someone had taken when it was built. The mortar needed repointing in several sections, but the walls were plumb, and the corners were true, and the roof, as far as she could see from the ground, was intact, except for one section over the far end of the platform where something had come through. The round window above the entrance was intact. The platform boards were gone in 3 sections, simply absent, rotted away, or taken by someone who needed wood. She walked the perimeter the way she had always walked a new commission, starting at the outside and working inward, making no marks yet, only looking. She noted the downspout pulled away from the east wall, the door to the station master's office, oak, intact but swollen in its frame. The small window on the north face that had lost its glass but retained its frame, and the platform storage room. She had read about it in the property description, but she found it by walking the platform edge and seeing the outline of the door in the brickwork below. A low timber door set into the foundation with a hasp and a padlock that had rusted entirely through. Whatever was inside had not been opened in a very long time. She did not try it that day. She took out the mechanical pencil and the notebook and began a rough elevation of the south face from where she stood, her first deliberate drawing of anything in 3 years, and the pencil moved across the paper with the ease of something that had never been forgotten, only set aside, and she stood there on the cracked concrete of the platform approach and drew until the light changed. She slept in the station master's office that first night, her coat over her and her bag under her head, and the notebook in her hand. And she lay in the cold and the dark, and listened to the building around her and felt, underneath the cold and the difficulty of the floor, the particular quality of stillness that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be. She was back at the county office the next morning to ask about the storage room. The property records showed it listed as a maintenance storage area, contents unknown, sealed at station closure in 1981. The key, if there had been one, was not in the county records. She bought a bolt cutter from Clem's hardware store on the main street of Ferris Hollow. Clem was 57, with short gray hair and the direct economy of movement of someone who had run a store alone for a long time and had no patience for anything that was not the actual thing. She watched Eugenia come in and walk to the tools section and find the bolt cutters, and then stand there for a moment looking at the sizes with her head slightly tilted the way a person looked when they were calculating rather than browsing. "You need a bolt cutter, or you need to talk through what you need a bolt cutter for," Clem said from behind the counter. Eugenia looked up. She told her about the station and the storage room. Clem was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the bolt cutters on the left were better made than the ones on the right, and that if the padlock had been rusting since 1981, it would not put up much resistance regardless. She also said that there was a folding work table in the back that had been waiting for someone to take it off her hands for the better part of 2 years, and that Eugenia was welcome to it if she could use it. Eugenia told her she could use it. Clem came around the counter and looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. "You measuring twice before you do anything," she said. It was not quite a question. Eugenia said that she supposed she was. Clem nodded. "That's a particular kind of person," she said, and took her to the back to show her the table. The bolt cutter handled the padlock exactly as Clem had predicted. The door to the storage room opened inward, scraping against the concrete floor, and the smell that came out was of sealed air and old paper and something metallic that Eugenia identified after a moment as the smell of technical ink. She had to duck to get in. The room was low-ceilinged, perhaps 8 feet deep and 6 wide, brick on 3 sides, and the timber underside of the platform above. A single bare bulb socket with no bulb, 2 wooden shelves, empty, and against the back wall, a metal cabinet, dark green, approximately 4 feet tall and 2 wide, with 2 swing-arm latches on the front that were not locked. She opened it. Inside, in vertical slots, stood a series of rolled drawings. She counted them without touching them first. 41 rolls, each wrapped in a sleeve of oilskin that had protected them in the sealed room for more than 40 years. She lifted the first one carefully and carried it to the platform surface and unrolled it in the afternoon light. It was a hand-drawn engineering diagram, ink on linen, the regional railway line, a section she recognized from the property description, drawn with an exacting precision that made her go very still. She understood, looking at it, what she was holding. This was not the work of a draftsman producing adequate documentation. This was the work of someone who understood what they were doing at the level of love for the work itself. The line weight was controlled and deliberate across the entire sheet. The notation was in a careful, technical hand that held its consistency from the first mark to the last. In the lower right corner, the draftsman's details, a set of initials, the date, and the name of the railway company. She sat on the platform surface and spread the drawing in her lap and looked at it for a long time. She unrolled 3 more. They were all the same quality, ink on linen, precise and complete, and in a state of preservation that should not have been possible, and was, she understood, possible only because of the sealed room and the quality of the oilskin wrapping and the climate stability of a brick underground space that had been kept from light and moisture for 4 decades. She worked through the rolls methodically, opening each one, reading the title block and the date and the content, rolling it carefully back and returning it to its slot. Track gradients, bridge specifications, platform dimensions and load calculations for the stations along the line, culvert diagrams, signal box layouts, the complete engineering record of a regional railway from its construction through its final operating years, hand-drawn on linen with a care and consistency that she recognized as the signature of a single draftsman who had produced the entire body of work himself. The 30th drawing she unrolled showed a spur line, a planned extension of the main line to a small depot on the edge of town, labeled Ferris Hollow Goods Depot, with a completion date of 1933 that had never been met. The accompanying notation referenced a land deed, a formal conveyance of 2.5 acres from a named private landowner to the railway company for the purpose of the planned depot. The boundary markers were described precisely, and she copied them into her notebook, her handwriting exact and small, the way it had always been when she was noting something that mattered. She set that drawing aside and kept going through the remaining 11. The 41st drawing was different. It was not an engineering diagram. It was the same linen, the same ink, the same hand. But it was a portrait. A woman, seated at a drafting table, her back to the viewer, her right hand raised with a pen in a familiar position, the position of someone making a careful mark. The drafting table was detailed precisely, the instruments laid out beside her drawn with the same care as the engineering drawings. The woman's hair was pinned up, the back of her neck was visible. She was absorbed in her work. She had no idea she was being drawn. In the lower right corner, the draftsman's initials and a date. July 1929. No name for the woman. Eugenia held the drawing for a long time. She did not know who this woman was. She thought about that, about the draftsman who had spent his working years making precise technical drawings of track alignments and platform dimensions and gradients, and who had one day in July of 1929 picked up his pen and drawn the woman at the table beside him with the same care and precision he brought to everything else he made, and folded her into the cabinet with the engineering drawings and sealed it up. She rolled it carefully and put it back in its sleeve. She was sitting on the platform in the late afternoon light with her notebook open and the mechanical pencil in her hand when the truck pulled into the station approach. The man who got out was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movement, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its life. He stood by his truck and looked at the station for a long moment before he looked at her. His name was Aldous. He had worked on the regional railway for 22 years as a track maintenance supervisor until the company folded and took his pension with it. He had been living in his truck for 4 months, moving between towns, and he had driven to Ferris Hollow that afternoon without being entirely sure why, except that there was a station here, and he had always oriented himself by stations. He asked if anyone owned the place now. Eugenia said she did. He looked at the building for another moment. Then he asked if she needed anything done. She looked at him. She asked him what he knew about platform construction. He said he had replaced more platform sections than he could count in 22 years of track maintenance. She said there were 3 sections that needed replacing and that she had no money to speak of, but could offer a room that was not his truck. He said that sounded fair and got his bag out of the cab. Fern arrived 11 days later, on foot, which Eugenia noted without comment. She was 22, recently discharged from the military after 4 years as an equipment maintenance technician, with a precision of movement and a habit of standing slightly apart from whatever room she was in, as if she had not yet decided whether she was staying. She said she had heard there was work at the old station, and that she could fix most things mechanical and some things structural, and was not afraid of confined spaces or heights. Eugenia asked her if she was afraid of cold. Fern said not particularly. Eugenia told her about the room and the oatmeal, and Fern looked at the station for a moment in the assessing way that Eugenia was beginning to recognize as the sign of a person who thought before they acted. She came inside. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that Eugenia would think about later as the weeks when the station stopped being a project and became a place. The distinction was not something she could have articulated at the time, but she felt it happening the way you felt a temperature change, gradually and then all at once. Clem was a constant. She appeared most mornings with something useful, a bag of hardware, a length of copper pipe she had sourced from a plumber in the next town who was clearing old stock, 2 cans of paint in a warm cream color that she said had been sitting on the shelf for 2 years and were not going to get more useful by waiting. She never announced any of it. She arrived with the thing, set it down, assessed what was happening in the building that morning, and either stayed to work or left to open her store, and the rhythm of it was so unforced that Eugenia found herself looking forward to the sound of Clem's truck in the approach the way she had once looked forward to the first cup of coffee of the morning as a particular and reliable start to the day. The building work had a logic that Eugenia understood from the drafting room. You started with the structural, then the environmental, then the functional, then the habitable. The platform sections were structural, and Aldous handled most of them, pulling what remained of the rotted boarding and replacing it with salvage timber that he sourced with an efficiency that reflected his 22 years of knowing which suppliers in the region had what and at what price. He worked steadily and without fuss, and the sections he replaced were as solid as anything that had been in the building originally, which Eugenia confirmed by checking them with a level and a load calculation she did on paper, and then redid because she did not trust her arithmetic the first time, and it came out the same both times. Fern took the electrical and the mechanical. She worked through the building's systems with the systematic patience of someone who had been trained to understand machinery from the inside out, finding the faults and tracing them to their source before doing anything about them. She was not impulsive. She diagnosed before she acted, and she documented what she found in a small notebook she kept in her breast pocket, noting each fault and its cause, and the fix applied. So there was a running record. Eugenia noticed this and said nothing about it except once, when she looked over Fern's shoulder at the notebook and said, "Good habit." Fern had glanced up and said she'd had it since the service, and that was all that was said. There was an evening in the third week when the four of them, Eugenia and Aldous and Fern and Clem, who had stayed past her usual time, were sitting at the work table in the waiting room with the remnants of a meal between them, and nobody was saying much, and the quality of the silence was the particular quality of people who have been working alongside each other long enough that silence is comfortable rather than something to fill. Outside the waiting room windows, the April light was going in long, pale strips across the platform surface. The round window above the entrance caught it and threw a faint circle of light onto the opposite wall. Eugenia noticed the circle of light on the wall and looked at it for a moment. Nobody said anything. They just sat in the quiet and the light and the accumulated fact of what they had been building together, and that was enough. When Eugenia found her in the station master's office in the early morning before the others were up, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 separate mechanical assemblies disassembled in front of her in neat rows, a defunct padlock, the broken latch mechanism from the storage room door, and the internal mechanism of a seized window fitting she had found in the platform debris. She was not fixing them. She was just looking at them, arranged by component type across the floor, as if seeing the inside of how things were made was something she needed to do before the day could start. She looked up when Eugenia appeared in the doorway. Her expression was briefly unguarded in the way that being caught doing something private and harmless made a person unguarded. "I'll put them back," she said. Eugenia said she should take her time. She set a mug of tea on the floor beside her and went to start breakfast. Aldous' moment came 3 weeks in, on a cold morning when he had been working since before light on the second platform section, replacing boards he had sourced from a salvage yard 2 towns over that Clem had found for them. Eugenia came out at 7 in the morning with coffee and found him sitting on the platform edge with his legs hanging over the side, looking down the track line, which had been removed years ago and was now just a bed of old ballast stones running away into the tree line. He was not doing anything. He was just looking. His hands were on his knees, and his face had the expression of someone returning somewhere they had not been for a very long time. She sat down beside him with her own coffee and looked where he was looking. After a while he said, "I used to know every mile of this line." She said, "Tell me about it." He did. For the better part of an hour, she sat on the platform edge beside this man she had known for 3 weeks, and listened to him describe a railway line that no longer existed from the perspective of someone who had walked its length in all weathers, and knew every bridge and gradient and problem section and curve. He spoke about it the way she might have spoken about a set of drawings she had lived with for years, precisely, with affection, from the inside. She understood, listening, that his grief was not only for the pension and the work, but for the thing itself, the line, the mechanism of it, the fact of it running through a landscape that had needed it and had not known until it was gone how much it had needed it. She did not say any of this. She just listened. At some point Clem's truck appeared in the station approach with a load of materials she had sourced, and Aldous stood up and went to help unload, and that was the end of it, except that from that morning Aldous talked more, not much more, but enough that the building felt less like a project and more like a place where people were. The drawing happened on a Tuesday in late April. Eugenia had set up Clem's folding work table in the waiting room, which was the largest and lightest space in the building, with 2 south-facing windows that caught the afternoon sun. She had been using it for the property assessment drawings, precise elevations of each face and floor plan diagrams of the interior, the kind of documentation that she needed for the building permit application. These were working drawings, functional, necessary. But on that Tuesday afternoon she sat down at the table with the notebook open and did not open the permit file. She looked at the waiting room around her, at the proportions of it, the way the afternoon light fell through the south windows and crossed the floor, at the old ticket window with its iron grill still in place, at the round window she could see through the open door above the entrance, at the accumulated small transformations that 4 months of habitation had made in the space. And she drew it. Not a technical drawing, not a measured elevation. A drawing that was precise in the way that she was always precise, that had the correct proportions and the correct shadows and the correct fall of light. But that was also something else, something that she did not have a professional term for, but that she recognized as the difference between a diagram of a thing and a portrait of it. She drew for 2 hours without looking up. When she finally set the pencil down and looked at what she had made, Aldous was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. He looked at the drawing for a long time without speaking. He came closer and looked at it more carefully, at the light on the floor and the iron grill of the ticket window and the proportions of the round window visible through the door. "That's this room," he said finally. She said it was. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You got it." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She understood what he meant, and he knew she understood, and that was the complete transaction of it. She picked up the pencil. She turned the drawing over and wrote the date on the back and her name in the small, careful capitals she had always used to sign her work. If you have made it this far into Eugenia's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The Railway Heritage Trust arrived in August. It was a historian named Bram who made the first contact, a man in his 60s who had been researching the regional line for a decade and who had heard about the drawings from someone who had heard about them from someone who attended the same church as Clem. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a camera and a pair of cotton gloves and a notebook that was already half full, the notebook of someone who had been thinking hard about what he was going to find before he arrived. He spent 4 hours with the drawings in the storage room, photographing each one, handling them with a care that Eugenia recognized as the care of someone for whom these things were not artifacts but living records, documents that still had work to do in the world. He did not speak much while he worked. Occasionally he made a sound that was not quite a word. Once he set a drawing down on the platform surface and stood back from it with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a full minute before he picked it up again. When he was done, he came and found Eugenia at the work table and stood in the doorway of the waiting room and looked at her for a moment. He said, "Do you know what you have here?" She said she thought she did. He said she probably did not know all of it yet. He said he would call the trust that evening. He called the trust the same evening. A conservator arrived 2 weeks later with an assessment team. They confirmed what Bram had suspected. The drawings were the most complete surviving collection of hand-drawn engineering documents from the regional lines construction period. The linen and the ink were in extraordinary condition. The collection was, the conservator said, looking at Eugenia with an expression that was still adjusting to what she had found, something they had not known to look for, because nobody had known it existed. The trust made a formal offer within the month to acquire the drawings for their permanent archive and to fund, through a conservation partnership grant, the restoration of the station's waiting room as a permanent exhibition space for the regional line's history. The grant was substantial. It covered the waiting room restoration and a modest operating fund. It also came with something the grant letter called a deed of recognition, a formal acknowledgment of Eugenia's role in the preservation of the collection. She read the grant letter at the work table in the waiting room. The mechanical pencil was in her hand. She set it down on the table beside the letter and looked at the room around her, at what it was becoming and what it would be, and she sat there for a while without doing anything at all. Bryce arrived on a Saturday in October. He was composed and well-dressed, and he stood in the waiting room of the station with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the exhibition panels that Fern had helped her mount, at the photographic reproductions of the engineering drawings, at the portrait of the unknown woman framed above the work table with a card beneath it that said, "Drawn July 1929. We do not know who she was. If you do, please tell us." He looked at all of it for a while. Then he said that it was remarkable, what she had managed, and that he imagined with the grant funding and the Heritage Trust involvement, she would want to think about how to manage it properly going forward, and that he knew people with experience in this kind of institutional management who might be able to help. Eugenia was standing at the work table. She set down what she was holding. She said, "Bryce, I know you believe you are being helpful. I want you to hear me when I tell you that I do not need your help managing what I have built. I needed your help 8 months ago when I was sitting in a motel room with $250. That is when I needed you. This is not that moment." He started to say something. She said, "You are welcome here whenever you want to come. As my son, not as someone with a suggestion about management. I mean that, but I will ask you to leave if you come here to arrange anything." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was complicated and not yet resolved. He said he understood. He was not sure he did, but he said it. He left. Eugenia stood in the waiting room after he had gone and looked at the portrait of the unknown woman above the work table. The woman at her drafting table, her back to the viewer, her pen raised, entirely absorbed in her work. 97 years of looking at a wall in a sealed room, and now here, in a station that was becoming something again. Nobody had come forward about her. The card had been there for 3 months. People stopped and read it every time. Nobody knew. Eugenia thought about that. She thought it was all right that nobody knew. Some things were complete exactly as they were. Willa called on a Sunday evening in November, late, when the station was quiet and Aldous was asleep, and Fern was in her room, and the waiting room had the particular quality of nighttime stillness that Eugenia had come to love. The building breathing around her, the cold outside pressing gently at the windows. Willa's voice on the phone was unsteady in the way of someone who has rehearsed something many times and has abandoned the rehearsal at the moment of the call and is now simply saying the true thing. She said she was sorry. She said she had known, in the driveway that morning and in the car, and at every point since. that what she had allowed to happen was not something she could justify. She said she had been trying to find the version of the apology that covered it adequately, and had finally understood that there was no such version, and that she was calling anyway. Eugenia listened. She said, "Willa, the door here is open. It has always been open for you, but you have to walk through it yourself. I cannot do that for you." Willa said she understood. She said she would come. Eugenia said she would be here. She sat in the waiting room after the call with the mechanical pencil in her hand, turning it slowly. The engraving along the barrel, her name in small capitals, worn slightly at the letters from 30 years of handling. She thought about the draftsman who had drawn 40 engineering diagrams and 1 portrait, and sealed them in a room where nobody would find them for 43 years. She thought about the woman at the table in the portrait who did not know she was being drawn, and who had no idea that 100 years later a stranger would frame her on a wall and ask who she was. She thought about what it meant to make things with precision and care, and to put them into the world not knowing what would become of them. She thought she might understand that better than she used to. In December, a young man arrived at the station alone, on foot, with a pack on his back, and the particular held-together look of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time and was running low. He stood in the station approach and looked at the building and did not come up to the door. Eugenia saw him from the waiting-room window. She went to the door and opened it and said, "It is very cold out there. Come inside." He looked at her from the approach. He looked at the station behind her. He came inside. She brought him to the work-table and poured coffee, and asked him nothing that he was not ready to answer. Above the table, the portrait of the unknown woman looked out at the room. The mechanical pencil was on the table beside the coffee cup. Outside the waiting-room window, the December light was thin and pale and clean. She had spent 38 years drawing the bones of other people's buildings. She had not known until she drew this one that she had been practicing. If something in Eugenia's story found you, leave a comment and tell us what it was. And if you know someone who is holding the bones of something they stopped believing in, share this with them today. We will keep telling stories like this one because there is no shortage of people who built extraordinary things and were told by the world that they were finished. The door here is always open. Come back and we will have another one waiting.